Welcome back everyone to another episode of Bookmark Theater. I'm your host Bookmark. So last time, the show Hannibal managed to pull ahead of Hannibal the films by the hair of their little Will Graham, but now it's time for round two, and anything could happen as we go into finally answering the question of who did it best, Hannibal versus Hannibal. So this series has been a bit of a sausage fest so far, so I think it's time we finally ask the question of who did it best, Clarice Starling. So while you may be thinking, hey, that's not fair, Clarice was never in the show. And you'd be right, the show's narrative focused solely on Will Graham, so there really was no space or reason to bring Clarice on. Adding her to the story also would have been a big mistake because it just wasn't her story, and trying to tackle Hannibal's relationship towards her while still exploring the relationship he had with Will Graham would have just made the show feel overcrowded in my opinion. That being said though, while the character wasn't in the show by name, that doesn't mean that they left out Clarice Starling completely. If you've only ever seen the film Hannibal but not read the book, you may have gotten the wrong idea about how Harris intended to end the love story between Clarice and Hannibal. In the book, Hannibal escapes Mason Verger's death trap with an unconscious Clarice and leaves Mason to be finished off by his sister Margaret, who he had systematically abused in the past. She steals his fortune, kills him, and blames the whole thing on Hannibal. This was something that was done very well in the show, but was completely omitted from the film. From there, Hannibal takes Clarice to a seaside manor where he treats her wounds and later begins a drug regimen and rounds of psycho-conditioning in an attempt to brainwash her into believing that she is Hannibal's long-dead sister Misha, who died in World War II and was unknowingly his first human meal. The show's answer to this is in the form of Dr. Bedelia Maurier, a former psychiatrist of Hannibal's and played by the lovely Gillian Anderson. Dr. Maurier in the show is what Clarice was meant to be by the end of the book. Her character isn't a straight parallel to Clarice's, but they did incorporate so much of what made Clarice's character good that you really get to see Gillian shine in this role. Her situation shows us how Hannibal can not only be menacing, but also seductive. His dark nature draws Maurier in to where she actually participates in Hannibal's killing, but always in the vein of a curious observer. The way she handles Hannibal is even interesting. Maurier doesn't just cower in fear of Hannibal, she actually challenges him, psychoanalyzes him, and tries to help him with his situation. The dynamic made even better because you don't know whether he's going to kill her at any point. And this is what made Maurier's character great in the show. She was a person, she was a character, she had flaws, she had backstory. Speaking of which, do you remember why in Silence of the Lambs that Clarice kept waking up to the screamings of the lamb? Do you remember how she had psychomagic trauma that allowed her to really get an interesting character arc? Me neither, says Ridley Scott. And this is why, in comparison, Julianne Moore's portrayal of Clarice Starling is so damn weak. And that is, she has no problems. Whether it be the book, the show, or the films, Clarice Starling always had some sort of trait to build a good chemistry between her and Lecter. As in the books, it was always her desperation to save Catherine Martin and her own psychological traumas that allowed such a great, powerful bond to build up between them. Maurier shows us also how tempting it can be to live like Hannibal and go off the deep end. But with Moore, there's nothing. She's allowed almost no growth as a character, which I think Ridley Scott did a great disservice to the character. By sanitizing the ending the way he did, he robs Clarice of her arc, making her a total Mary Sue in this version. Hell, even Hopkins points this out.
Remind you of your courage and incorruptibility. All you would need for that, Clarice, is a mirror.
And by robbing her of this arc, you rob her of any growth as a character. Part of the catharsis of Hannibal's ending was the fact that Clarice had become disillusioned with the FBI. She left her old life and decided to start a new one with Hannibal. But with Scott, as a result, you have the same fucking character you started with, no different from the first frame on the screen. And the only downside to Maurier, in my opinion, is really her writing. There's definitely something going on with that dialogue she's given. I mean, does the woman ever not sound like a supervillain? And her exit from the story was a bit rushed, but that can be forgiven because this just frankly wasn't her story they were telling. And while I want to give both these characters' portrayals their dues, was there any question about which one was best?
Dr. Lecter, my name is Clarice Starling. May I speak with you?
What can you say about such an iconic performance? Foster took this role and knocked it out of the park. She is everything the book was and more. Everything about her character, from the wardrobe to the makeup to the accent, all of it is flawlessly integrated into the character. Foster managed to capture so much of the original character that it allowed us to both be a surrogate for our viewing of the film, but also she was able to surprise us with her actions. And the themes the film brought up were just adding more layers of intrigue to her. Foster's own past and experiences become part of the case. Her outlook on life, her gender, her personal griefs just made her interesting to watch as Hannibal. Here, Foster can match Anthony Hopkins toe-to-toe for acting-wise. And, fun fact, if you didn't know, these two had actually never spoken before on Silence of the Lambs. After the first initial reading, Foster was so scared of Hopkins' performance that she actually took steps to avoid him on set. And after filming had wrapped up, it turns out that Hopkins was just as intimidated by Foster as she was to him. If the show ever gets another season, I'm sure they'll give Jodie Foster a run for her money. But as of now, the Queen still reigns. Point goes to the film. Oh, screw it, the anticipation's killing me. So before you start, you should know that Hannibal the character in the book was a lot different than his screen film adaptations. Harris described Hannibal as a slim, sleek, middle-aged man with dark hair, crimson eyes, and a special medical condition that gave him an extra metacarpal, or a sixth finger. He was also an avid artist, great cook, and a patron of the symphony, and despite his skill at it, detested the practice of psychiatry. And stepping back from his character portrayals, the actual character of Hannibal Lecter makes no sense just standing from a criminology standpoint. Let's go down the list. He is a white male of middle age, he does have a history of violence, and a history of interest with cannibalism. But besides that, there's no other markers of Hannibal Lecter being a killer, let alone a cannibalistic serial killer. He's not isolated, he's able to excel in both school, social activity, and has a thriving social group. His interests are diverse, so killing isn't his escape from the mundanity or a thrill. Hannibal doesn't derive any pleasure from the killings, as we saw in the killing of his guards and the nurse in Silence of the Lambs. His killings are both reactionary, like with the census taker, but also motivated, like with the flutist at the Philharmonic Orchestra, and he's not of the lower socioeconomic class because he's a fucking PhD. So really, when you look at Hannibal in both the films, show, and the books, there's no consistency. Hopkins exhibits much of his psychopathic and tricksterish nature with how he torments and disturbs people that come to him for help, while Mads is much more ingrained in his insanely high intellect and skill at manipulation, and Gaspard Ulliel is... Okay, let's talk about Hannibal Rising for a second. Gaspard Ulliel was given a very thankless task with this role. Not only did he have to pick up the mantle of one of pop culture's most beloved antiheroes, but he also had to be the catalyst for his origin story. And honestly, for what it is, I really liked it. Look at how Gaspard plays Hannibal. Love it or hate it, this is an original performance. Gaspard doesn't try to emulate Hopkins' style at all. Hannibal in this is his own unique character. As far as film portrayals go, this Hannibal is the most with the extensive arc. First frightened, then traumatized, then rebellious, then calculating, then vengeful. Because the film gave us so much time to look at Hannibal as a person, we get an actual character at the end of it and not just a monster. But the biggest problem with this version is that its story doesn't fit into the larger context of the former trilogy. In the film, Hannibal becomes a cannibal not through interest or desire, but through vengeance. And this isn't anything unheard of. The Maui were famous for consuming their foes after they killed him, but the film tries to tie this back into him being tricked into cannibalism to his later exploits as Hannibal the Cannibal. And that just doesn't work. Eating human flesh for survival does not translate into recreational killing of innocent people. Taken as an independent work, I think this film would have fared a lot better. But the problem is, even the personalities don't line up. Anthony was a sadist, a contrarian. Gaspard is stoic and noble. He's not a monster. He's killing to avenge and protect those he loves. Basically, there's a big divide between these two characters that a lot of people can't overlook. And I'm not trying to show favoritism towards Hannibal Rising, but I did want to give this version its dues. So, Mads versus Anthony. So originally, I thought of these two portrayals as two sides of the same coin, Hannibal pre and post capture, and then I realized that was wrong. These two aren't showing different sides of Hannibal, but in fact different pieces of him. After reading the book, I saw these two portrayals differently. The character of Hannibal is larger than life, and we love him for it. He was all the actor's portrayals and more, and that's hard to bring across in a consistent character. And what amazed me about these two was how they were able to achieve the same thing but with different approaches. Both make you uncomfortable, but Anthony looks at you like you're a piece of meat he wants to take a bite out of. Mads, however, looks at you and you feel like you're being scanned. The contrast is indicative of their acting methods. Mads is stoic, calm, nefarious, and his cold, calculating demeanor makes him both terrifying and yet compelling. And Hopkins achieves something similar. Cold, yes, but in a more inquisitive way. Some people are meat and some people are meat eaters. Psychologically, to him, people are not victims or perpetrators or killers, they are simply outcomes of what they have experienced. However, these two are quite unique from each other as well. Both of them seem to hate the practice of psychiatry, but each see the value in having it. Mads uses it as a weapon. He gets into your head, gaslights your mind, and makes you a killer. And that's fucking brilliant. This is the kind of guy you could point a gun at and he'll make you think you're pointing the gun at yourself. Anthony, meanwhile, uses psychiatry as a way of affecting people, and this goes a long way in establishing the power dynamic in the film. Hannibal has no power over his body or life, however, still has power over his mind, and with it manages to hold the cards in any situation. But these guys aren't called Hannibal the Cannibal for nothing, and again, very different. As far as I can tell, neither of these two eats human flesh for pleasurable reasons, yet they still obtain pleasure from it. The killing is incidental. To Hannibal, life is about the finer things, and eating human flesh is grandeur through its rarity, the ultimate form of luxury. But the way they go about harvesting the meat are complete opposites. Mads' killings are reflective upon their victims. If he finds you insignificant or trivial, your death is likewise. If he finds you repulsive, he won't just let your meat go to waste, he'll sew it back into you. If he feels that your life is not his to take, then he gets others to rightfully do it. For Mads, when he kills, the act is very coldly done, almost mechanical. No pleasure or passion put into it. He's just doing a job. But whenever he's displaying or preparing his kills, it holds the passion of an artist. Through death and cannibalizing you, he's improving you. Hopkins is a little less complicated. His cannibalizing of you is a judgment of your character, or in other words,
to show his contempt for those who exasperate him.
His eating of you is almost an insult. Your worth as a human being is less than that of meat. But unlike Mads, when Anthony kills, it's almost a performance. This guy takes his time and loves what he does. Anthony talks with his victims, torments them, and when it comes time for someone to die, baby, this boy is Baryshnikov and he wants you to see him dance. Now these two are great, but as you can guess, they have problems. Hopkins, I know you're having a good time here, buddy, but god do you need to tone it down in a couple scenes. His eccentric portrayal does cross the line into just being hammy more than once. And god, does he ever not act creepy? One thing you can say about Mads' portrayal is at least that guy can function. Mads, alternatively, only really has one problem, but it's kind of a big one. Besides never not sounding like a supervillain, Mads' character is very heavily stooped in what I call the Dexter Death Note problem, and that is, there is a limited amount of time a dude can do this shit without getting caught. The show did reach a level of critical mass more than once with its bullshit getaways, and the show does try to subvert this in the second season, with Will taking Hannibal's place and Hannibal taking Will's, and from then onward the disbelief just got harder and harder to suspend. And that's the main problem with Mikkelsen's character. His character was so loved by the fans that it went to the show's head. He got too big, he got away too many times, and for fuck's sake, the man can't kill someone to save his soul. Hannibal Season 2's finale, how the hell did those people survive that? And that's what's so great about the films. Much like the Joker in The Dark Knight, they used Anthony Hopkins just enough to make him stay captivating. Every time he was on screen, the scenes were intense, and the scope of his actions were kept tight and believable. He wasn't a supervillain or a mastermind. He was a doctor.
Dr. Lecter?
So unlike my usual formula, who did it best this time will be decided not just by the characters, but also story and style. So without further ado, let's ask, who told the best story? So despite these stories pulling from the same well, the story and structure are both day and night. They chose similar storylines and characters, but they decided to focus on different things. The films are very goal-focused in its structure. This means every scene with every conversation is ultimately for the completion of a goal, whether it's to save Catherine Martins, catch Hannibal, catch the Tooth Fairy, or avenge his sister. All of this goes to serve these purposes. The show approaches this differently. It has conflicts, yes, all narratives need them, but here the shift is made to focus more on the characters and their interactions. To put it into perspective, this would be like comparing Lord of the Rings to Game of Thrones. In Lord of the Rings, everything that occurs on screen is meant to further the plot and achieve the goal. Get the ring to Mount Doom, defeat Sauron. Everything that occurs in these films, from Bag End to Rivendell to Helm's Deep to Minas Tirith to the Fields of Pelennor to the Crack of Doom, all of this is build-up and progression towards the overarching goal. Compare this to something like Game of Thrones, which has goals, yes, like who will conquer the Iron Throne, who will survive, if, where, and when are those ice zombies going to get taken care of, but the main draw for this is its characters. Who lives, who dies, who talks with whom. The medium of television allows for this much more focus on character interaction while slowly moving towards the overarching goal. And these type of stories are deeply ingrained in their format. You couldn't make Lord of the Rings into an 8-season television show, and you couldn't do Game of Thrones justice with a 9-hour film trilogy. So back to the Hannibals. In each way they chose to tell their story is pretty much the reason for their benefit and their flaws. As I said before, the show does get to feeling a bit like a soap opera after a while, and both it and the movie's quality does fluctuate quite a bit. The show uses its shocking moments and imagery to keep the peaks and valleys going. And while the films do adhere very rigidly to a 3-act structure, its use of dialogue and captivating moments and its intensity keeps you on a ride. I'm talking about the basement scene, the brain scene, hell, the embalming scene. All of this was incredible, but truthfully, the show is what takes it. And the reason for this is that the show is a response to the films. The writers for the show took a look at Hannibal and said, how can we tell this story and tell it differently and better? It took what worked before and reworked it in a new way, and that's what makes the show so brilliant. It's based off of a well-known property, it takes a lot of cues from the earlier works, so you get what you come to see, but is set in a way that it can still surprise us. And in a way, this is what makes the show so brilliant. It's something old, made into something new. Point goes to the show. So for our final point, we're going to be asking the question, who told the story the best? This is different than the previous one because I'm asking about, in the usage of cinematography, set design, acting, dialogue, and so forth, which one told their story the best? Let's begin. Honestly, I've been wanting to add this category for a long time, but wanted to wait for something where I could go, this is what I'm talking about. Film language is exceedingly complex, and at any moment, the information is being given to you by framing, movement, sound design, dialogue, or action. By the merits of this, the show is a masterpiece of visual storytelling. The imagery here is both very unique and intensely striking. The use of light, color, dark shadows, and incredible use of editing just make this a marvel of television. Its use of negative space, slow motion, drives home a feeling of surrealist here, and the show uses this a lot. I was actually kind of surprised about how much time is actually taken up just watching rain and blood fall in slow motion. But, to be honest, it works. It's used to emphasize when something dramatic or important is happening. The slowdown here helps you to enjoy the moment and take everything in. But if we're talking about iconic imagery here, the films have it all. Jonathan Deems in Silence of the Lamb did something very unconventional and had his characters talk directly into the camera, speaking directly to the fourth wall. This is something you are told to almost never do, but it is used as a tool of immersion. We feel what the characters feel, we see what they see, and as a result, the film is almost known for this stylistic choice. Hannibal takes a more Hollywood-looking approach to its aesthetic, weirdly turning the color palette blue. In fact, all these works have that quality. Have you ever noticed that in all these works, all of them have the same color palette reminiscent of the time they were made? From 90s brown to early 2000s blue, to late 2000s French hypercolor, and then to the dark 20-teens gothic shades. And speaking of color, say what you want about Hannibal Rising. This is easily the most beautiful film in the saga. I mean, just look at this. Ben Davis is a British director of photography who's worked on things like Doctor Strange, Guardians, Stardust, Kick-Ass, and Avengers, and his landmarks are all over this film. The blood is deep and red, the yellows are bright and acidic, the greens are violent and toxic, and the blues are miserable and suffocating. And while dialogue and framing are important parts of storytelling, the show has to take it here for its incredible sound design and art direction. In the case of the show, every element of storytelling is on display here. I was legit blown away at how forceful the show hits your senses. It achieves the perfect balance of dark and gothic and beautiful. Even the CGI was incredible. Half of these scenes you could take a picture of and frame it as art. Deep, surreal, gothic imagery used to incredible effect made this show an experience I wasn't prepared for and I've not experienced since. Point goes to the show. They did it best. So thank you all for tuning in. I'm so glad that people seem to be liking these episodes, so I'll keep making them. Let me know down below in the comments if you agree with me that the show was superior to the films in terms of Hannibal's portrayal, or if you disagree with me, let me know. I'd love to read them. And just as a quick update, I will be starting my second year of college soon, so the updates on this channel are going to get a little dry for a little while. I will have 2 new videos coming up soon. Both of them involving animation, one of them involving extra credits, if you know who they are. I will also be doing a part 2 of something, and also I will be having another episode of Who Did It Best, or something a little bit different than Who Did It Best. And as a clue, I can tell you... Sorry. Reese Witherspoon, not now. Okay, so as for the clue to my next episode... I'm sorry. Renona Ryder. That was the one. I forgot Renona Ryder's name. This has been Bookmark Theater. I'm your host, Bookmark. See you later.